Chapter 2, Research Methods by Rachel Rondinelli, Megan Jimnicki, and Clea Robbins. One of the major and most well-known research methods is the scientific method. The scientific process is a self-correcting process for asking questions and observing nature's answers. The scientific process starts off with hypotheses, which are testable predictions. The second step is experimental study. In the experimental step of the process, we test our hypothesis and collect information. Lastly, we gather our data and finalize a conclusion. During the entire scientific process, each professor or leader of the experiment must be aware of biases and other contributing variables. Two main variables of an experiment are independent and dependent. An independent variable is a factor of an experiment that is manipulating an object or subject. A dependent variable is the variable that may change in response to manipulations. For example, if you are going to put hair dye in your hair, the dye would be the independent variable and the hair would be the dependent variable because the hair is manipulated whereas the dye remains the exact same. Another two important variables are control groups and confounding variables. Confounding variables are factors other than the independent variable that might produce an effect in an experiment. A control group is a group of people in which are unchanged and not experimented on in order to compare against the tested group. For example, if one group of test subjects were given a new vitamin and another group of people were not, the group not given the pill would be the control group. During this experiment, of course, there would be very many subjects that might contrast because of dietary, exercise, and sleeping habits. These habits would all be considered the confounding variables.
Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is a tendency to believe after learning the outcome that you knew it all along. An example of hindsight bias would be on the evening of an important World Series game, your friend predicts that the Red Sox are going to win by a large margin. In fact, the Red Sox do end up winning the game, causing your friend to boast, "I predicted it." Overconfidence. Overconfidence is when we tend to think we know more than we do. One example of overconfidence that many people can relate to is that 82% of U.S. drivers consider themselves to be in the top 30% of their group in terms of safety. Another example of overconfidence is when a person who thinks his sense of direction is much better than it actually is. The person could show his overconfidence by going on a long trip without a map and refusing to ask for directions if he gets lost along the way. Correlation. Correlation has a few types. One of them is called positive correlation. Positive correlation is when the variables go in the same direction. For example, studying and grades hopefully has a positive correlation. Negative correlation is when variables go in opposite directions. For example, heroin use and grades probably has a negative correlation. Another type of correlation is illusory correlation. Illusory correlation occurs when we perceive relationships where there are none. And last for me is naturalistic observation, which is observing subjects in their natural environment. An example of naturalistic observation can be found in many experimental psychology courses. In one study, a student researcher stands on a corner with a stop sign. He or she is holding a pad of paper or a similar recording device. The student notes whether passing drivers completely stop at the sign. The second phase of the observation takes place on the same corner, except this time the student is hidden. Equal time is given to both sections on the study. In general, people will make sure to come to a complete stop when they know they're being observed. For this study to have real weight, it needs to be done many times.
Measures of data. There are three ways to measure central data: mean, median, and mode. The mean is an average. You add together your data and then divide it by the number of data points you have to get an approximate middle value. For the median, you would put your data in a numerical order and find the middle value by going down the line. If there are two data values as the median, you simply average them together to form one number. Mode is simply which data value occurs most often. Once finding these measures of central tendency, you can interpret distribution graphs which lay out the data. A normal distribution occurs when the mean, median, and mode are all the same. However, outliers, data values that are drastically larger or smaller than most, can skew the distribution. These are negative or positive skews. These simply mean the mean is being pulled toward the lower or higher section of the data. Then there are measures of variability, range, and standard deviation. Range is subtracting the largest data value from the smallest. Standard deviation is used to show the variance of scores around the mean. A less variable data set is more desirable because it is more stable. Survey method. The survey method is used to gather data through interviews in person or over the phone, or questionnaires through the mail or over the internet. This is a good method because it is cheap and anonymous and gathers data from a diverse population. It can be bad, however, because people can lie or misinterpret themselves. Also, there are different beliefs and behaviors as well as generalized results. It is important to use random sampling to choose participants from the population for the survey. An example of a survey would be asking students how many hours they study in a night. Case study. Case studies are used to study a similar situation or a small group of people in great detail. This is good to use for the most information, but can take a long time to complete and can only be done once. Case studies are also near impossible to create since most occur by observing a tragedy or a unique medical issue. Double-blind procedure and placebo effect. The double-blind procedure is used for experiments where both the participants and the facilitator are unaware of which group has the real substance and which has the placebo. This is commonly used for testing drugs by measuring the effects of the drug against the people taking the placebo. With both unaware, bias, a discrimination, even if unintentional, is avoided. The placebo effect describes the phenomenon of people experiencing something like a drug's effects, even if it is just a sugar pill given. The brain's anticipation of a reaction can create it without the outright influence of the drug itself.
Thank you for watching.